Driver takes lost child home, without knowing he was the heir to a fortune. David Johnson hit the brakes when he saw the blonde boy standing on the corner, crying and clutching a crumpled piece of paper in his small hands. It was almost 7 in the evening. Traffic was heavy on Fifth Avenue, and that child clearly shouldn't have been there alone. That's when the boy desperately waved at the yellow cab. David rolled down the window and saw the swollen blue eyes from crying. "Mister, can you take me home?" the child asked, his voice trembling. "Of course, little one. Hop in," David replied, unlocking the doors. The boy climbed into the back seat and handed over the crumpled paper. David took it and tried to read the scribbled childish handwriting. "Magnolia Drive, 847, Beverly Hills." He read aloud. "That's far from here, son. How did you end up on Fifth Avenue?" "I got off the school bus at the wrong stop," the boy answered, wiping his nose on the sleeve of his beige t-shirt. "I wanted to visit Mrs. Dorothy." David started the cab and headed toward the address. Through the rearview mirror, he watched the boy, who looked about 8 or 9 with neatly cut blonde hair and good quality clothes. "Who's this Mrs. Dorothy?" David asked, keeping the conversation going. "She was my nanny when I was little. She's the only one who treats me like a real person." The boy replied with a maturity beyond his years. David felt a pang in his chest. He had a son the same age, little Michael, and knew how important it was for a child to feel loved. "And where are your parents now?" "Mom and Dad are traveling." Again, the boy's voice grew even sadder. "They're always traveling. They left me with Mrs. Margaret, but she's always on the phone talking about papers and meetings." The traffic was heavy, typical rush hour in New York City. David took the chance to get to know his passenger better. "What's your name, son?" "Ethan. Ethan Blackwell Montgomery," the boy answered. "And yours?" "David Johnson. Nice to meet you, Ethan." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us newcomers out. Now back to the story. On the way to the upscale neighborhood, Ethan shared more about his life. He talked about the private school he attended, how lonely he felt in the mansion that was too big, and how much he missed his old nanny, who had been let go 2 years ago. "Why did Mrs. Dorothy leave?" David asked, genuinely curious. "Dad said she was too old to take care of me, but I think it was because she argued with him about some things I didn't really understand." David watched through the window as the streets grew increasingly elegant, lined with huge houses and plenty of security. When they finally reached Magnolia Drive, he nearly choked seeing the imposing gate of number 847. It was a 3-story mansion with sprawling gardens and a guard booth with 2 security men. David had never seen such a luxurious home up close. "This is your house?" he asked, stunned. "Yeah," Ethan replied casually. "Pretty big, huh? Sometimes I get lost inside." David got out of the car and walked Ethan to the gate. When the guards saw the boy, their relief was instant. "Ethan, thank God!" one of them shouted, rushing to open the gate. "Mrs. Margaret has been frantic looking for you." Within minutes, a middle-aged woman in formal clothes came running from the house entrance. "Ethan Blackwell, where were you?" she yelled, clearly upset. "I called the school, the family, I looked everywhere." "Sorry, Mrs. Margaret, I just wanted to see Mrs. Dorothy," Ethan mumbled, hanging his head. The woman finally noticed David standing by the cab. "Did you bring Ethan home?" she asked, approaching. "Yes, ma'am, I found him lost on Fifth Avenue," explained David. Margaret opened her purse and pulled out several $100 bills. "Thank you, sir. I don't know how to thank you. Here, this is for you." David looked at the money and shook his head. "That's not necessary, ma'am. I just did my duty. Any father would do the same." "But, sir, this was so important. If something had happened to Ethan..." She stopped speaking, as if she'd said too much. Ethan, who had overheard the conversation, ran to David and grabbed his hand. "Uncle David, can you come back tomorrow?" he asked with hopeful eyes. "I don't have any real friends." David's heart clenched again. He thought of his own son, Michael, who always had school friends to play with, while this wealthy boy lived isolated in a mansion. "Of course, Ethan. If Mrs. Margaret allows it, I can come visit you." Margaret hesitated for a moment, but seeing the happiness on Ethan's face, she agreed. "All right, you can come in the late afternoon when Ethan gets back from school." David said goodbye and returned to his cab, deep in thought. On the drive home, he couldn't shake the sadness in that child's eyes. It was as if behind all that luxury, Ethan was a prisoner of his own wealth. When he arrived at his middle-class neighborhood, he found his wife Jennifer preparing dinner and his son Michael doing homework at the kitchen table. "Dad!" Michael shouted, running to hug David. "How was your day?" "It was interesting, son," David replied, returning the hug. "I met a boy your age today." Over dinner, David told Jennifer about Ethan, without going into details about the family's wealth. "Poor child," Jennifer remarked. "Money can't buy family love." "Dad, can you bring him to play ball with me?" Michael asked, excited at the idea of a new friend. "We'll see, son. Maybe." The next morning, David couldn't focus at work. He kept thinking about Ethan all day, wondering how the boy must feel in that school full of classmates who probably only got close to him because of his money. In the late afternoon, as promised, David drove to the Montgomery mansion. Ethan was waiting at the window and ran to the gate as soon as he saw the yellow cab. "Uncle David, you really came," Ethan shouted, beaming with happiness. "Of course I did. A promise is a promise," David replied, smiling. Margaret appeared shortly after, but her face was tense, worried. "Mr. David, I'm glad you came. I need to speak with you," she said quietly. She led David to a secluded corner of the garden, away from Ethan, who was playing with a toy car. "Sir, something serious has happened. Ethan's parents, and they're not just traveling," she began nervously. "What do you mean?" "They left 3 weeks ago. Since then, the whole family has been in constant meetings about Ethan's custody. The boy doesn't know anything yet, but I don't know how long we can keep hiding it." David felt a chill in his stomach. "And why are they fighting over custody?" "Because Ethan is the sole heir to all this," she gestured to the mansion. "The family corporation is worth millions, and there are people very interested in controlling that inheritance." At that moment, David understood why Margaret had been so desperate the day before. It wasn't just Ethan's safety at stake, it was an entire fortune. "You seem like a good man," Margaret continued. "Ethan hasn't spoken to anyone since his parents left. Only with you yesterday did he smile again. I was thinking, maybe you could keep coming here as his friend." "Of course I can," David replied without hesitation. "But why are you telling me this, Mom?" "Because there are people in the family who can't be trusted, and Ethan needs someone who's on his side, not on the side of the money." When David Johnson said goodbye that afternoon, Ethan begged him once again to come back the next day. On his way home, David thought about the situation. That boy needed protection, but he was just a cab driver. What could he do against a powerful family? On the third day of his visits, David arrived at the mansion and found several luxury cars parked at the entrance. Margaret came running toward him. "Mr. Johnson, thank goodness you're here. The family is gathered, and Ethan is really scared," she whispered quickly. "They're arguing over who's going to take him in." David entered the house for the first time. The interior was even more impressive than the outside. Antique furniture, expensive paintings, marble staircases. But there was a tension in the air that clashed with all that beauty. Ethan was sitting on a huge sofa, looking even smaller in that grand setting. When he saw David, his eyes lit up, and he ran to hug him. "Uncle David, they're saying things I don't understand," Ethan whispered in his ear. In the main room, David could hear raised voices. A well-dressed middle-aged man was gesturing emphatically as he spoke to the other adults. "That's Richard, Ethan's uncle," Margaret explained quietly. "He wants custody so he can manage the business. And you don't think he'd be a good guardian? He doesn't even look at Ethan. All he cares about are the inheritance papers." David watched the scene with growing anger. These adults were arguing over a child's future as if he were an object, just a means to get to the money. Richard noticed David and approached. "Who are you?" he asked rudely. "David Johnson. I'm Ethan's friend," David replied calmly. "Friend?" Richard scoffed. "Ethan doesn't need poor friends. He needs to learn how to interact with people of his own social standing." Ethan hid behind David, clearly intimidated by his uncle. "With all due respect, sir," David said, "a child needs love, not money." Love doesn't pay the bills or run a multi-million-dollar corporation, Richard shot back. You know nothing about our world. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us newcomers out. Now, back to the story. The argument was cut short when an elegant woman in her 60s arrived. Everyone fell silent as she entered the room. "Grandma Eleanor," Ethan shouted, running to hug her. Eleanor Montgomery, Ethan's paternal grandmother, was an imposing woman despite her age. Her white hair was perfectly styled, and she wore a simple but expensive dress. "My dear grandson," she said, hugging him with genuine warmth. "How are you?" "Confused, Grandma. Everyone keeps saying weird things and I don't understand any of it." Eleanor scanned the room, studying each person present. When her eyes landed on David, she seemed to size him up for a few seconds. "And who is this young man?" she asked. "That's Uncle David, Grandma. He's my friend," Ethan said excitedly. "Your friend?" She looked intrigued. "Tell me more about that, Ethan." Ethan eagerly started explaining how David had found him when he was lost, how kind he'd been, and how he'd promised to come back to visit. Eleanor listened carefully to every word. "Interesting," she murmured, looking at David again. "Mr. Johnson, may I have a word with you?" Eleanor led David to a smaller, more private room. Ethan tried to follow, but she asked him to stay and play with Margaret for a few minutes. "Mr. Johnson, I'll be direct," began Eleanor, settling into an elegant armchair. "My grandson has been an orphan for 3 weeks. Since then, the family has been fighting over his custody, but in truth, they're fighting for control of a $200 million inheritance." David nearly fell out of his chair. $200 million was an amount he couldn't even fathom. "I can see you genuinely care about Ethan," Eleanor continued. "That's rare these days, especially when so much money is involved. Mrs. Eleanor, I didn't know about this inheritance when I met Ethan. I only care about his well-being." "I know, and that's exactly why I want to make you an offer." David waited in silence, unsure what to expect. Ethan's parents left a very specific will. They foresaw that the family would try to use the boy to access the money. So they created a special clause. What kind of clause? Ethan can choose his own guardian. As long as that person shows genuine love for him and has no financial interest, you fit that profile. David was stunned. The idea of being responsible for a multimillionaire child was too absurd to process. "Mrs. Eleanor, I'm just a taxi driver. I can't manage an inheritance of this magnitude." "But you have something no one else here does. A heart in the right place," she replied with a smile. "And Ethan has already chosen you as his trusted person. But this is crazy. I have my own family, my simple life. And that's exactly the simple life Ethan needs. He spent his early years surrounded by luxury, but without real love. His parents realized this and wanted to change." Eleanor explained that Ethan's parents had discovered, just before passing, that the family corporation was involved in questionable dealings. They had planned to overhaul everything but ran out of time. They left very clear instructions. Ethan should grow up with the right values, far from the greed that corrupted the rest of the family. They wanted him to learn the value of honest work before taking on any financial responsibility. "And if I accept this responsibility, what happens to the rest of the family? They'll receive an allowance to live on, but won't have access to the company's control or Ethan's upbringing. You would be the legal guardian of everything." David felt the weight of the decision. Accepting would mean completely changing his life and his family's. Refusing would mean abandoning Ethan to people who only saw him as a means to get rich. "Can I talk to my wife about this?" "Of course, but don't take too long. Richard is pressuring the lawyers to speed up the custody process. If he succeeds, Ethan will grow up as a puppet in his hands." When David left the mansion that afternoon, his head was spinning. How could he explain to Jennifer that he'd been asked to be the guardian of a multi-millionaire child? At home, during dinner, David told Jennifer everything. She listened quietly, asking pointed questions to better understand the situation. "David, this is very serious," she finally said. "It's not just about Ethan. It's about dealing with very powerful people who won't like losing control of so much money." "I know, but what if it were Michael in a situation like this? Wouldn't you want someone to protect him?" Jennifer sighed. She'd known her husband for 15 years and knew he couldn't abandon a child in danger. "Dad, what are you talking about?" asked Michael, who had overheard part of the conversation. David explained the situation simply to his son, without mentioning the sums involved. "So, Ethan would come live with us?" Michael asked excitedly. "Maybe, son, what do you think? That'd be awesome. He could share my room and we could play video games together." Michael's innocence made David Johnson smile. To a child, what mattered was having a friend, not the money. "Jennifer, I need to make a decision by tomorrow." "Then let's sleep and pray to make the right choice," she replied, taking her husband's hand. The next morning, David woke up with certainty. He couldn't abandon Ethan. Even knowing the risks, he wouldn't be able to live with a guilty conscience if something bad happened to the boy. He called Eleanor and arranged a meeting. When he arrived at the mansion, he found the house in chaos. Margaret ran to greet him. "Mr. Johnson, thank goodness you're here. Richard brought lawyers and is trying to force custody today." In the main room, Richard was gesturing aggressively while speaking to 3 men in suits. Ethan sat in the corner, clearly frightened by all the commotion. "Grandma Eleanor, Uncle David is here," Ethan shouted when he saw David enter. Eleanor approached David with a hopeful look. "Well, what's your decision?" David looked at Ethan, who watched him with expectant eyes. At that moment, all doubt vanished. "I accept. I'll take care of Ethan." The smile that spread across Ethan's face confirmed David had made the right choice. The boy ran to hug him. "Really, Uncle David? You'll stay with me?" "Yes, champ. We'll take care of each other." Richard stopped talking when he realized what was happening. "What are you talking about?" he asked angrily. Eleanor stood by David's side. "Richard, Ethan has made his choice. According to his parents' will, David Johnson will be his new legal guardian." "This is ridiculous," Richard exploded. "A taxi driver handling a $200 million inheritance? Have you lost your minds?" "The money will be managed by experts," Eleanor explained calmly. "David will only be responsible for Ethan's education and well-being." One of Richard's lawyers spoke up. "Mrs. Eleanor, this can be challenged in court. A man without means can't provide the proper standard of living for the child." "The proper standard of living is love and protection," David countered, finding his courage. "And I can give that in abundance." Richard stepped closer to David with a threatening expression. "You don't know who you're messing with, driver. This family has influence and power. We won't let some nobody ruin our business." "I'm not ruining anything. You're the ones using a child for your own interests." The tension in the room was palpable. Ethan clung to David's leg, sensing something very serious was happening. Eleanor slammed her fist on the table, getting everyone's attention. "Enough! This decision isn't up for debate. The will is very clear and will be honored. David, I need you to sign some papers." For the next 2 hours, David signed an overwhelming number of documents. Eleanor explained each one. Legal guardianship, responsibility for Ethan's education, access to specific funds for the child's needs. "You'll receive a monthly allowance for Ethan's expenses," she said, "but the bulk of the inheritance will remain in a trust until he turns 25. What if I want Ethan to keep living in the mansion?" "You decide where and how Ethan will live. That's your responsibility now." Richard and his lawyers left the house furious, vowing to challenge everything in court. But Eleanor seemed confident the will was solid and couldn't be easily overturned. When they were alone, Ethan climbed onto David's lap. "Uncle David, are you like my dad now?" "Something like that, champ. I'll take care of you and you'll help take care of me. Deal?" "Deal. Can I meet Michael?" "Of course, he's excited to meet you too." Eleanor watched the scene with emotion. "David, thank you for accepting this responsibility. I'm sure it was the right choice." "Grandma Eleanor, can I ask you something? Why didn't you want to keep custody of Ethan?" "Because I'm already 72 years old. Ethan needs someone who can guide him into adulthood, and he needs to learn values that, unfortunately, I couldn't teach the rest of the family." David understood that Eleanor carried guilt over how the family had become greedy and selfish. She saw in Ethan a chance to start fresh. "One last thing," Eleanor said, handing David a folder. "Here's information about Ethan's former nanny, Dorothy. She was fired because she confronted his parents about how they were raising him. Maybe you'd like to talk to her." That night, David took Ethan home. Jennifer had prepared Michael's room for their new family member, and Michael was eagerly waiting in the living room. "Hi, Ethan. I'm Michael," the boy said as soon as they walked in. "Hi, Michael. Uncle David told me a lot about you," Ethan replied, still a little shy. Within minutes, the two boys were playing as if they'd been friends for years. Jennifer watched with a smile. "I think we made the right choice," she whispered to David. "Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us just starting out." Now back to the story. In the following days, David tried to establish a new routine. Ethan woke up early, had breakfast with the Johnson family, and went to school in David's taxi. In the afternoon, he played with Michael and helped Jennifer in the kitchen. "Aunt Jennifer, can I learn how to bake a cake?" Ethan asked on the third day. "Of course, sweetheart. Michael wants to learn too. We can do it together." It was amazing how quickly Ethan had adapted to the Johnsons' simple life. He seemed genuinely happy, happier than David had ever seen him in the mansion. But the peace didn't last long. By the end of the first week, David started noticing strange cars parked near their house. Men in suits were watching the family's movements. "David, I think we're being watched," Jennifer said, worried. "I noticed too. It must be Richard's people, trying to find something to use against us in court." Things got worse when David went to pick Ethan up from school and found the boy talking to a stranger. "Ethan," David called, rushing over. The man quickly walked away when he saw David approaching. "Who was that, Ethan?" "I don't know. He said he knew my dad and asked if I was happy living with you." A chill ran down David's spine. Richard was clearly trying to use Ethan to gather information or plant doubts in the boy's mind. That night, David decided to visit Dorothy, the former nanny. He found her address in the papers Eleanor had given him and went to see her at a modest house in East Harlem. Dorothy was a black woman in her 60s with a warm smile and sharp eyes. When David introduced himself, she invited him in. "So you're the one taking care of Ethan now?" she asked, serving coffee. "Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Eleanor said you might help me understand the family situation better." Dorothy took a deep breath before speaking. "I took care of Ethan from the day he was born until he was 6. His parents were always traveling, leaving him with staff. He grew up without any real family." "And why were you fired?" "Because I confronted his father about it. I told him Ethan was growing up without love, without values. Mr. William didn't like hearing the truth." Dorothy explained that she'd noticed changes in Ethan's parents in the months before she left. They seemed worried about something and started asking questions about values and education. "Mrs. Catherine came to me a week before passing away," continued Dorothy. "She regretted firing me, said she wanted Ethan to learn to be a good person." "Did she leave any message?" "Yes, she did." Dorothy got up and went to fetch a box from a shelf. "She gave me this to give to whoever would take care of Ethan in the future." Inside the box was a sealed letter with the words, "To the new guardian of Ethan," written on the front. David opened the letter with trembling hands. The handwriting was delicate, feminine. "To whoever is reading this letter, if you are with Ethan, it means William and I are no longer here to care for him. I hope it is someone who truly cares about our son as a person, not as an heir. Ethan is a sweet and intelligent child, but he grew up isolated from the real world. We want him to learn values we failed to teach: simplicity, generosity, honest work. In the family corporation, we discovered practices that don't align with who we want our son to become. That's why we created a will to protect Ethan from those influences until he's old enough to decide for himself. Dorothy knows Ethan better than anyone in the family. Seek her advice whenever you need it. She truly loves our son. Take good care of our boy. Teach him that a person's worth isn't in what they own, but in who they are. With eternal gratitude, Catherine Montgomery." David finished reading the letter with teary eyes. It was clear Ethan's parents had recognized their mistakes and tried to make amends, even if too late. "Do you think Ethan should know about this letter?" asked David. "When he's older, yes. For now, he just needs to feel loved and protected." David returned home with the letter tucked close to his heart. He now had confirmation he was doing the right thing, but he also felt the weight of responsibility grow heavier. In the following weeks, the Johnson family settled into a new routine. Ethan was adjusting well to his new school, simpler than the previous one, and had made several friends. "Uncle David, can I invite Jack over to play?" Ethan asked one day. "Of course you can, champ. This is your home now." It was comforting to see Ethan acting like a normal child, caring about friends and games instead of business and money. But Richard hadn't given up. He filed a lawsuit contesting the will and began a campaign to disqualify David as guardian. David Johnson is a man with no formal education, no means to provide the proper standard of living for Ethan Blackwell Montgomery, declared Richard's lawyer in a preliminary hearing. David's lawyer, hired by Eleanor, countered, "Your Honor, the proper standard of living for a child includes love, attention, and moral values. David Johnson provides all of that, while the plaintiff only shows interest in the inheritance." The judge ruled that a psychological evaluation of Ethan would be necessary to assess his well-being in the new situation. When the psychologist arrived at the Johnsons' home to evaluate Ethan, she found a child visibly happier and more sociable than in previous reports. "Ethan, do you like living here?" "Do you like living?" the doctor asked during their conversation. "I love it. Uncle David and Aunt Jennifer really take care of me. And Michael is like a brother." "What do you like most about your new home?" "Everything. Helping Aunt Jennifer in the kitchen, playing in the yard with Michael, sometimes going to work with Uncle David in his taxi. At the other house, I was always alone." The psychologist observed Ethan's interaction with the Johnson family for an entire afternoon. She saw a child who was integrated, engaged, and genuinely happy. "David, Ethan is showing clear signs of emotional improvement," she said at the end of the evaluation. "He was visibly depressed in the previous reports. Now he shows joy and confidence." The psychologist's report was crucial for David's defense in court, but Richard still had other tricks up his sleeve. One morning, when David took Ethan to school, he found reporters at the door. "Mr. Johnson, is it true you're just a taxi driver, handling a $200 million inheritance?" shouted one reporter. David shielded Ethan and quickly entered the school, but he realized Richard had taken the fight public. In the following days, newspapers and websites ran stories about the taxi driver who became a multi-millionaire's guardian. Some supported David, others questioned his ability. "Daddy, why are people filming our house?" asked Michael, worried. "It's just a mess, son. It'll pass soon," David replied, trying to stay calm. But the pressure was affecting the whole family. Jennifer had to deal with co-workers asking nosy questions, and Michael was teased at school by some classmates. "David, I don't know if we're ready for this," Jennifer confessed one night after the kids went to bed. "I'm scared too," David admitted, "but I can't abandon Ethan now. He trusts me." The situation worsened when Richard began publicly questioning David's honesty. "How did a simple taxi driver convince a millionaire child to choose him?" he declared in an interview. "There's something very suspicious about this story." Richard's insinuations were dangerous. He was suggesting David had manipulated Ethan, which could result in losing custody. That's when something unexpected happened. Dorothy, the former nanny, decided to break her silence. She gave an interview to a TV station, telling the whole truth about the Montgomery family and defending David. "I took care of Ethan for 6 years and I know when a child is happy," she said on TV. "David doesn't want the money. He wants what's best for the boy. Richard, on the other hand, only cares about the inheritance." Dorothy's interview shifted public opinion. Other staff from the Montgomery mansion also began speaking up, sharing how Richard had always treated Ethan with coldness and indifference. Margaret, the housekeeper, was particularly blunt. "In 3 weeks living with David, Ethan has talked and smiled more than he did in months at the mansion. Anyone with common sense can see he's right where he belongs." Community support also surprised David. Neighbors, fellow taxi drivers, and parents from Ethan's school began publicly defending the Johnson family. "David is a man of integrity," declared Mr. Anthony, the owner of the taxi cooperative where David worked. "I've known him for 10 years and I know he'd do anything for those kids." The public rallying for David deeply angered Richard, who intensified his attacks. "These people don't understand the responsibility of managing a fortune," he said in another interview. Ethan needs to be around people of the same social standing, not taxi drivers. Then Ethan, who had overheard part of the interview on TV, asked to speak with David. "Uncle David, why does that man say bad things about you?" David sat beside Ethan on the bed and tried to explain as simply as possible. "Ethan, some people think only those with a lot of money can take care of kids who also have money. But I believe love is what matters most." "I believe that too," Ethan said, hugging David. "You love me more than anyone in my real family ever did." That conversation gave David an idea. If Ethan wanted, he could give his own testimony about where he preferred to live. On the day of the decisive hearing, the courthouse was packed. Journalists, onlookers, and supporters from both sides crowded the steps. Richard arrived with a team of 5 lawyers and impeccable clothes. David had only the lawyer hired by Eleanor and a simple but clean outfit. "Your Honor," began Richard's lawyer, "this situation is absurd. Ethan Montgomery is the heir to a business empire and cannot grow up in poverty." "Your Honor," countered David's lawyer, "financial poverty is not the same as poverty of character. Ethan is receiving something money can't buy, genuine love." The judge listened to arguments from both sides for over 2 hours. Then he asked to speak with Ethan privately. "Ethan, do you understand what's happening here?" the judge asked gently. "Yes, Your Honor. You're deciding where I'll live." "And where would you like to live?" "With Uncle David, Aunt Jennifer, and Michael. They're my family now." "Why choose them over your Uncle Richard?" "Because Uncle Richard never played with me, never asked if I was sad or happy. Uncle David teaches me important things and makes me laugh." "What kind of important things?" "That you have to help people, that you have to work for what you want, that family isn't just about blood." The judge was impressed by Ethan's maturity and clarity. When they returned to the courtroom, the judge announced his decision. "After reviewing all aspects of this case, including the child's emotional well-being, I declare that Ethan Montgomery will remain under the guardianship of David Johnson." The room erupted in applause from David's supporters. Ethan ran to hug his guardian, while Richard stormed out furiously. "This isn't over," he shouted to reporters. "I'll appeal to the highest courts." But David knew he had won the most important battle: Ethan's heart. In the following months, life settled. Richard continued filing appeals, but without success. Ethan adjusted completely to life with the Johnson family and began excelling at his new school. "Uncle David, can I use some of my money to help the school?" Ethan asked one day after seeing the poor condition of the library. "Of course you can, champ. But first, let's talk with Grandma Eleanor about how to do it right." Eleanor was moved to see Ethan showing interest in helping others. "That's the true sign you're raising him right," she told David. Ethan began participating in social projects at school and in the community. With guidance from David and Eleanor, he learned to use small amounts of his inheritance for important causes. "It's amazing to see how Ethan is growing," Jennifer remarked. "He's learning that money is a responsibility, not a privilege." A year later, when Ethan turned 10, the Johnson family threw a simple backyard party. Ethan invited all his school friends, Dorothy and even Eleanor. "Uncle David," Ethan said during the party, "thank you for teaching me how to be truly happy." "Thank you for teaching me that family is who we choose to love," David replied, moved. Richard made a few more legal attempts, but the case was definitively closed. Ethan had found his real family. 2 years later, when Ethan turned 12, David received an unexpected call. It was from a lawyer representing other members of the Montgomery family who had sided with Richard. "Mr. Johnson, my clients would like to make an offer," the lawyer said. "They're willing to pay $5 million for you to relinquish guardianship of Ethan." David didn't even need to think. "Sir, Ethan is not for sale, not for $5 million, not for $50 million. "Mr. Johnson, think carefully. It's a lot of money, and Ethan is far more important than any amount of money." When David told Jennifer about the offer, she smiled proudly. "I knew you'd say that. That's why I love you so much." Ethan, who had overheard the conversation, hugged David tightly. "Uncle David, if they offered $100 million, would you sell me?" "Not for all the money in the world, champ. You're my son in my heart." The years passed, and Ethan continued growing up like a normal child, despite his multi-million-dollar inheritance. He helped with household chores, got good grades in school, and participated in social projects. By the time he turned 15, Ethan had already helped renovate 3 public schools and created a scholarship program for underprivileged children. "Uncle David, when I grow up, I want to keep working to help people," Ethan said during a family dinner. "And you will, son. I'm sure of it." Michael, now 14, was like a real brother to Ethan. The two were inseparable and shared everything. "Dad, Ethan is the best brother I could ever have," Michael told David one day. Dorothy, who had become a constant presence in the family, watched Ethan's growth with satisfaction. "Mrs. Catherine would be so proud to see how the boy has grown," she remarked to David. When Ethan turned 18, he gained access to part of his inheritance. His first decision was to buy a bigger house for the entire Johnson family. "Uncle David, the house is ours now. I don't want you driving a taxi if you don't want to," Ethan said. "Ethan, working keeps me well, and you need to learn that work dignifies a man, no matter how much money he has." David continued driving a taxi by choice, but now only worked part-time to spend more time with his family. On the day of Ethan's high school graduation, the entire Johnson family was in the audience. The young man was chosen to give the class speech. "I've learned that family isn't determined by blood or money," Ethan said in his speech. "Family is who chooses to stand by us in hard times and teaches us to be better people." David wept with emotion upon hearing those words. He looked at Jennifer, Michael, and Dorothy beside him and realized he had gained far more than he could have imagined when he found that lost boy on Fifth Avenue. Richard, who was in the audience watching everything, finally seemed to understand that he had lost for good. After the ceremony, he approached David. "You did it," he said without anger for the first time. "Ethan became a good man. Maybe you all did the right thing." "It's never too late to be part of his life, Richard," David replied, surprising everyone. "No, I lost that chance long ago, but I'm happy to see he's in good hands." It was the first and last time Richard ever showed remorse for his actions. When Ethan turned 21, he decided to study business so he could one day take over the family company. But his vision was entirely different. "I want to turn our company into a model of social responsibility," he explained to David, "to use money to create jobs and help communities." David supported Ethan through the entire company transformation. The young man implemented education programs, created worker cooperatives, and developed environmental projects. "You're honoring your parents' memory," said Eleanor, now 80, but still following everything closely. On the day Ethan officially assumed the company presidency at 25, he made sure David stood beside him during the ceremony. "None of this would be possible without the man who taught me life's true values," Ethan said in his inauguration speech. The Montgomery Corporation became a national benchmark for social responsibility. Ethan created thousands of jobs, and his educational projects benefited tens of thousands of children. David, now 55, had stopped working as a cab driver and was fully dedicated to the company's social initiatives. "Dad," said Ethan, who had officially started calling David by that name, "I have a surprise for you." Ethan took David to the garage of the company's new headquarters. There sat the old yellow cab, completely restored. "Why did you restore my cab?" "Because this is where our story began, and I want it to stay here forever, reminding everyone that the best things in life can't be bought." David hugged Ethan with tears in his eyes. "I'm the one who should be thanking you, son. You gave my life meaning." "No, Dad, you gave me a life with meaning." End of story. Now tell us what you thought of this story and where you're watching from. Do you believe David made the right choice by accepting to care for Ethan? Share your honest thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear how you feel love can transform lives. Thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss other heartwarming stories.